We're going to do a first chapter read of Road Trip. I like Road Trip, and I'm looking forward to reading the first chapter of it. It's got one of the scariest kids I've ever written about, and it starts out with her on chapter 1. Stella could hear the sound of the janitor pushing the mop across the floor in the hallway, side to side and then back and forth, covering 3 squares across and 2 squares down. Then the splash of 2 dips in the bucket hard, and then the light creaking squeeze of the press after dipping into the water enough times. When the water was brown and gritty, the janitor would put the mop back into the bucket and use the handle to push the bucket, its wheels squeaking, down to the janitor's closet. Stella could see inside the janitor's closet from her seat on the bench, where there was an odd white sink mounted right on the floor with a short red hose hooked up to the faucet. She knew the mop bucket would be dumped into the sink and the gritty brown water leaving some sand behind. The janitor would use the hose to rinse out the bucket and then rinse out the sink, and then refill the bucket with the red hose up about halfway, add a splash of soap from a clear gallon jug. Then he'd put the mop back into the clean water, push the bucket back down the hallway to where he'd stopped and start again. 3 squares across and 2 squares down, over and over until the hallway had been cleaned of the morning's mud and salt tracked in on the students' boots and sneakers. Every step made a sound, and Stella listened from the bench outside the principal's office. She knew the sounds of the floor being mopped, the sounds of the soft click of the computer keys on the secretary's desk, the ring of the phone, the soft voice as the secretary and the principal decided if the call would be transferred or not. Stella knew the hallway, lined with lockers and old oak doors, and she knew the bench, oak, stained dark except on the 4 legs, square and tapered where the stain had worn off from the strokes of the mop over the past 60 years. The arms of the bench were scarred from the nervous hands of children made to sit there, dug at with pins and fingernails, a few initials half-made, interrupted when the child was caught, Stella guessed. Stella had tried to make the bench rock, but it was too solid, made not for beauty or comfort, but for utility, with the 4 legs level to the floor, and the bench heavy enough that her movement had no impact. She sat, her elbows on her knees, her hair in her face, her worn sneakers tapping on the floor, watching the janitor mop. Stella was 13, too old to worry about being in trouble, and too used to trouble to think much about it at all. Her current foster mother talked a lot about how lucky Stella was to be living in an age where beating children was looked down on. The woman was full of stories about she herself had been set on the right path, set hard enough that she never did that again. Stella never heard what the woman had done, and she wasn't particularly interested. She could see the resentment in her foster mother, the anger that Stella was only made to sit on the bench and not really punished for the day's infraction. "Maybe that's what you need," the woman had darkly whispered, filled with a bitter nostalgia, on the angry ride back to the foster home, where Stella would be sent upstairs to the room she slept in. Stella was quiet on the way back to the woman's house. She had nothing to say. No need to make the woman more angry. She looked out the window at the deep snow covering the hayfields and hills, piled deep against the sides of the houses and barns, the vague rounded shape of cars left to winter, the steep hills of broken snow piled outside the road and the driveways. Sometimes there was a pause in the noise the woman made. She might have been making a point or asking a question. Stella looked out the window, her breath fogging the window a bit. Stella wiped the fog away with her fingers, leaving streaks on the glass, and thought about the summer, when the snow would be gone, when she would find a creek or a pond and go for a swim. Summer was the season for running, as soon as it was warm enough to sleep outside and not freeze to death. Winters were long in Vermont, and dreams of summer helped everyone make it through. When the car was parked, the woman leaned back over her seat, pointing herself at Stella, her mouth moving and sounds coming out, sharp and half-bitten back. Stella watched the mouth, keeping her own face a careful neutral, no longer bothering to keep an eye on the hands. Stella had watched the hands at first, but this woman was a yeller, not a hitter, and Stella had relaxed her gaze. Stella waited until the woman had slammed her door and trudged through the thick snow back towards the small house. Then she opened her door, dragging her backpack up to her shoulder. The bag was an old LL Bean, green and black, and bigger than the backpacks the regular kids carried at school. It was tied at the top and worn at the bottom, where it sat on the floors at schools and foster homes. It was heavy and very full, and it was what Stella thought of when she thought of the word mine. Stella walked towards the front door, which was now closed. Stella knew that it wasn't locked. They had done this before, the woman and her, over and over. Stella walked past the kitchen, past the living room, past the TV filled with noise and big faces, and headed up the stairs. She went past the bathroom to the end of the hall and opened the door to her room. Stella liked her room, not the walls really, which were a smudged off-white, or the window, which was smudged with cracked blue trim. Not the carpet, which was light brown under the bed and in the corners, and a darker stain brown in the middle, where people would have walked over the past 20 years. Not the bed, a worn maple twin with stickers half covering the headboard, Smurfs and some kittens mostly. The rickety bed holding a thin mattress, safely zipped into a thick plastic bag. Even with the plastic, the bed smelled faintly of pee. There's the dresser, with the same mix of stickers on it. The dresser was completely empty. There's a chair, a metal folding chair, with the initials CBC and a number 86 stenciled on the back. And a plastic table that could serve as a desk if Stella ever needed a desk for some reason, which she didn't. What Stella liked about her room was that the door closed and that the light could be turned off. She liked the fact that she was far enough away from the television downstairs that she could rarely hear the beautiful people on the big screen laughing away at something that was supposed to be funny. She liked the lamp on the table, stickered as well next to the bed, which she could turn on late at night and read when she couldn't sleep. She liked seeing her blue duffel, still sitting on the table, after 3 weeks, unzipped, the left side for clean clothes, the right side for dirty. She kept her backpack beside it, full of books mostly, and the tiny bag of treasures she still had, tied tight and hidden in a zippered pocket. Stella liked the look of her room, ready for departure, looking just like it had on her first day, with no sign she'd ever been there. Stella lit lightly, like a bird on a branch, ready to fly at a moment's notice. Leave no trace was Stella's motto. So that's chapter 1 for Stella, but it keeps going. We're going to hear about Brandy. Brandy had seen Stella sitting on the bench. Brandy had felt tears coming back and raised a hand in class, seeking an escape and been allowed to find a bathroom. Her teacher had seen the tears and had known that her student was not even hearing her lecture on Vermont history, specifically the importance of Lake Champlain and the Hudson River in early settlement and trade. But the teacher had been teaching for a long time and no longer tried to be a part of her students' emotional lives, leaving that up to the parents and the guidance office if needed. She did nod to Brandy, giving the girl permission to leave. That was nice, anyway. Brandy had seen Stella sitting on the bench more than a few times that year. Stella had only come to Chelsea in October. It was a small school, but Stella was in the 8th grade, middle school technically, and Brandy was in the 10th grade, a sophomore, and Brandy and her friends knew little to nothing about the younger kids. Brandy was glad for an almost empty hallway, with only the little girl on the bench and the janitor, Mr. Carlton, doing his morning mop of the hallway. The janitor watched the floor, the little girl watched the janitor, and that was good. Brandy wanted to get to the bathroom, lock herself in a stall, and cry as quietly as she could until she could stop, wash her face, and get back to class. She was afraid that one of her friends would ask her what was wrong. Brandy pushed against the heavy door, dark oak with a brass plate at the bottom, ready for the kids who kicked doors, and a thick brass sign that said girls. The sign was as old as the rest of the school. There were 6 sinks in the front and 6 stalls, 3 on either side. The floor was made of big black and white tiles, making a checkerboard across the floor, with tall black rubber mopboards at the sides and a central drain right in the middle. Brandy glanced at the drain. Missy Parlow had dropped her new purity ring right down that drain only last year, while trying to show it to the other girls in the bathroom. It had seemed an awful omen at the time, and Missy's past year, dating first one senior boy and then another, seemed proof of the curse. Brandy shook her head, locked herself in the corner stall, and sat, thinking too late to check if the seat was dry. Her jeans were still up, and she felt nothing. There were girls she knew, girls afraid of touching the seat, who hovered above the suspect plastic, leaving a sprinkled mess behind. Brandy pictured her return to class with a wet ring around the seat of her pants, and she sighed. Brandy saw crying like any other trip to the bathroom. Get your business done, clean up, and head back to class. But she found herself dry-eyed, not happy, but not able to cry, not able to get the release she needed before she went back to Vermont history. Brandy thought of the little things, her dog Trudy run over in the street last summer. She thought of Kara Palmer, her best friend until this year. Now moving with a faster crowd, smoking pot and drinking beer, Kara, who'd called Brandy a baby for not joining in. When these things weren't enough, Brandy thought about her grandmother, who'd moved to New Mexico 3 years before. Sick of the winter and falling on ice, she was now in a nursing home in Albuquerque, her little house up by the mountains locked and empty, as she struggled to recover from a bad fall, and her life now shrunk down to a tiny room in some hospital-y place. Brandy had been to a nursing home here in Chelsea as part of her church outreach. It smelled of pee and old people, and Brandy was barely able to keep a pleasant smile on her face when she followed the youth leader going into the day room to sing and chat. The other kids didn't like it any better, and what had been planned as a monthly commitment only happened one more time. She hated to think of her grandmother in a place like that, unhappy and trapped inside. Before she moved, Brandy's grandmother had lived in Vermont, in Vershire, not too far from Chelsea. Brandy had been left with her grandmother in the summers and over Christmas break during the shifts her mother had worked at the post office. She remembered following the old woman out into the garden, picking weeds and then vegetables, and then going into the shade of the house for lemonade and cookies. Brandy remembered being read to in a big soft lap and naps, sleeping out on the screen porch with the ceiling fan turning slow circles overhead, her grandmother reading beside her. As Brandy thought about this, she no longer felt like crying. She felt warm and loved and happy. Brandy sighed, a tiny smile, as she remembered those summers at her grandmother's house. As she relaxed, the big thing, the thing she didn't want to think about at all, crept in and surprised her. Brandy felt her stomach lurch, her breathing now hard and getting harder. She felt a light sweat form on her face, and her mouth was suddenly full of spit. She stood dizzy and confused and turned, trying to get over the toilet before she lost her breakfast, and making it just in time. She held her hair back with her hands and leaned over, almost into the murky bowl, vomiting again and again until she was spitting out only a thick, sour bile. Her breath coming in gasps, and the burn of the vomit up her nose, and tears pouring out of her eyes. Brandy prayed that no one would come in and find her there, stinking the bathroom up and doing this awful thing. Those prayers, at least, must have been heard, because while Brandy emptied her stomach and her eyes, choking and feeling like she might well die, not a soul came into the girls' bathroom on the first floor. Brandy flushed the toilet, and then flushed it again, and then wiped at the seat and her knee and her mouth and her chin, and then flushed a third time. There was something nice about pushing the lever and seeing all the terrible things spin around in the water and disappear. Foreshadowing there. Brandy looked at herself in the scratched mirror. Her face was dead white, and her hair was still wet where she'd washed the tips out and pressed them dry with a paper towel. Her eyes were red, even after being flushed with cold water, and her nose was red too, like someone with a cold, or an old man who drank too much. She looked at the mirror and dabbed at her face, and then sighed, and took time to be thankful that no one had come into the bathroom. Brandy headed out into the hallway back to her classroom. The bench in front of the principal's office was empty. She wondered if the little girl had been sent home, or if she was inside the office getting yelled at by Mr. Jenkins. She thought that someone was having a worse day than she was, but it didn't make her feel any better. The long day stretched out ahead. Brandy felt sick and dizzy still, and afraid of the big thing, the thing she couldn't think about, that would come again. Brandy bit her tongue hard enough to stop the thoughts, but not quite hard enough to make it bleed, and pushed the door open. All the kids looked at her as she came back in, wondering, she knew, why she'd been gone so long, looking for evidence in her washed-out face. Her teacher looked at her too, sending a clear message that she'd been gone too long. Brandy made her way back to her seat and tried to pay attention. Something about Fort Ticonderoga, the French, the British, furs. Brandy felt her mind go blank in the comforting nothing of history class. So that's chapter 1, and you get introduced to Stella and Brandy. They don't know each other yet, but they're going to. And of course, the book is called Road Trip, so maybe there's a road trip in the future. Pretty great book.